You know what's wild? In ancient Egypt, there was something so valuable, so deeply woven into daily life that it wasn't just priceless. It was practically divine. And no, it wasn't gold. It wasn't jewels. It was a plant. A humble green reed growing along the Nile that built empires, preserved knowledge, and literally held civilization together. The world called it papyrus. The Egyptians, they just called it life. This wasn't just some swamp weed they tossed around. Papyrus was power. The kind of power that outlasts pharaohs and floods. You've seen those iconic images of ancient scrolls covered in delicate black ink with the unmistakable curves of hieroglyphs. Those were written on papyrus. Every deal, decree, religious text, and medical remedy. All of it flowed through this plant. But it wasn't just about writing. Papyrus was used in everything, from building small boats to crafting sandals, mats, baskets, and ropes. This plant was multitasking before it was cool. It could be stripped, soaked, pressed, and dried into a tough, flexible surface that outlasted empires. And Egyptians didn't just use it, they worshipped it. Papyrus symbolized rebirth and the divine flow of the Nile. It showed up in religious art, temple columns, and sacred offerings. If the Nile was Egypt's vein, papyrus was its bloodstream. So yeah, while gold sparkled in the tombs of kings, papyrus quietly shaped the story of a nation. It didn't just hold ink, it held identity. And the deeper you look into its legacy, the more you realize this plant wasn't just important, it was everything. Let's talk about what made papyrus so mind-blowingly useful. Because this wasn't some fragile leaf that crumbled in your hand. The inner pith of the papyrus stalk was like nature's version of duct tape, fibrous, flexible, shockingly durable, and practically begging to be transformed into something useful. The Egyptians figured out that if you sliced it thin, laid the strips in crisscrossed layers, and pressed it flat, it fused into a kind of ancient paper that could last thousands of years. Literally. We're still finding legible scrolls today that were written over 2 millennia ago. But here's the twist. Not every civilization had this advantage. The Greeks and Romans went nuts for papyrus. It was a hot commodity in ancient trade routes, and Alexandria became a global hub for the papyrus export business. Egypt didn't just keep their plant for themselves, they built an international economy around it. Imagine holding the monopoly on the internet. But 3,000 years ago, that was Egypt with papyrus. And because this paper was relatively easy to make, it allowed for widespread documentation, meaning the Egyptians were able to record everything from tax records to poetry. Medicine, astronomy, religion, architecture, all preserved on sheets of plant fiber. Without papyrus, the ancient Egyptian voice might have been lost entirely to time. Even the word paper comes from papyrus. That's how deep its roots go. This one plant literally seeded our entire concept of documentation. Our history books, our notes, our memes. None of that exists without the innovation that started in the Nile marshes. It's wild to think about, and trust me, it gets crazier. Now let's get into the economics, because papyrus wasn't just a cool invention, it was a power move. In ancient Egypt, owning papyrus was like owning intellectual real estate. You weren't just buying a sheet of writing material, you were buying access to knowledge, authority, and communication across borders. Scribes became elite professionals. Entire temple schools and bureaucracies were built around mastering this one material. And it wasn't cheap. While Egypt produced it in abundance, the price skyrocketed once it left the Nile Delta. Roman senators, Greek philosophers, Persian scholars, they all wanted a piece of the papyrus action. In some periods, papyrus became so valuable in international trade that it rivaled the worth of gold per sheet. Let that sink in. One scroll could buy you serious status. In fact, Egypt controlled the export so tightly that when other empires tried to replicate the process, they failed. Papyrus only grew well in the specific, swampy ecosystem of the Nile. Attempts to cultivate it elsewhere turned into botanical disasters, so Egypt stayed on top. This monopoly gave them soft power. Need scrolls for your Senate decrees? Better stay on good terms with the pharaoh. Want to archive your knowledge or preserve your religious texts? Better keep the papyrus pipeline flowing. It was genius, agriculture as empire. And that legacy didn't just fade away when parchment came around. Papyrus kept its prestige for centuries. Even now, fragments of those scrolls are teaching us things modern science is still unpacking. So yeah, this wasn't just a plant. It was Egypt's Wi-Fi, blockchain, and printing press rolled into one leafy powerhouse. Let's take a minute to appreciate how insanely durable papyrus was. You'd think something made from squished plant fibers would have crumbled into dust centuries ago, right? Nope. Papyrus had staying power. Archaeologists have unearthed scrolls from over 2,000 years ago that you can still read. Some of them even have intact ink on them, like a message from the past, written in bold black script that hasn't faded into oblivion. Part of the secret was in the plant's chemistry. Cypress papyrus naturally contains a bit of an antimicrobial kick. That meant fewer bugs, less rot, and a longer shelf life, literally. Combine that with Egypt's dry desert climate, and you've got a perfect preservation machine. That's why we know so much about ancient Egyptian medicine, law, religion, and even laundry lists. Because this one plant refused to die quietly. Even cooler, the process of making papyrus scrolls was weirdly advanced. They soaked strips of the stem, layered them crosswise, and then pressed the whole thing under rocks or wooden planks. As it dried, the natural sap acted like a glue, bonding the fibers together. No synthetic chemicals, no fancy machines. Just brute intelligence and craftsmanship. And that's not even mentioning the aesthetic. When you see papyrus under museum lights, it's beautiful. The texture, the golden hue, it almost glows. It's no wonder rulers and scholars considered it treasure. But while Egypt was hoarding intellectual currency, the rest of the world, scratching notes onto wax tablets or animal skins. Imagine sending a royal decree on cowhide while Egypt was basically handing out ancient iPads. So if papyrus was so magical, so ahead of its time, why did the world eventually move on? Simple answer: monopoly problems and paper politics. Egypt held a tight grip on papyrus production, especially during the height of the Greco-Roman world. They weren't just exporting a plant, they were exporting power. And anytime one empire controls the exclusive supply of something that valuable, you know what's coming. People get salty and they start looking for alternatives. That's where parchment sneaks in. Over in Pergamon, modern-day Turkey, scribes were getting sick of Egypt's export restrictions. So they started refining their own method. Scraping, stretching, and treating animal skins into a writing surface that was flexible and long-lasting. Was it as smooth or cheap as papyrus? Not at first, but it wasn't dependent on the Nile, and it didn't come with Egyptian politics. Over time, parchment caught on, especially in Europe. And then came paper. Real paper, made from pulped rags and plant fibers, finally showed up in the West, thanks to Chinese innovation, Arab transmission, and good old-fashioned empire expansion. Once the printing press hit the scene, papyrus didn't stand a chance. By then, the world had shifted. Egypt's dominance faded, trade routes changed, and papyrus, the OG gold leaf of knowledge, became a relic. Ironically, something so rooted in eternity was replaced by stuff that was meant to be disposable. Still, papyrus left its mark. The word paper itself comes from it. The roots run deep. It's kind of wild to think a swamp plant shaped the trajectory of human civilization. But papyrus wasn't just paper, it was infrastructure. It was how Egypt managed bureaucracy, built temples, collected taxes, and passed down the spells of the afterlife. You could be a farmer in Thebes or a scribe in Memphis, and your entire life, birth, marriage, property, even death, would be documented on papyrus. That's not just stationery, that's national memory, and sure, it didn't age perfectly. Most of what survived came from the dry sands of Egypt's deserts, where time slows down and decay takes a vacation. But those scraps gave us love poems, medical recipes, grain inventories, and divine revelations. Without papyrus, we wouldn't have half the window we do into that world. Even the act of writing changed. The brush evolved into the reed pen, which worked perfectly on papyrus's fibrous surface. Writing became more fluid, faster, like conversation instead of carving. Knowledge could finally spread in real time, and all from a plant that grew like a weed. But the real flex, Egypt didn't just use papyrus, they made the world depend on it. For centuries, Alexandria wasn't just a city, it was the cloud, a library of everything humans knew, all written on sheets of Nile-born green. They weren't just preserving culture, they were setting the terms for how culture would be preserved. So next time someone tells you plants can't be powerful, remind them a plant once ran the world. Not because it was beautiful or rare, but because it let humans record what mattered most. Stories, laws, memories, and dreams. All that from a stalk with a sticky core. Now, if papyrus gave ancient Egypt its voice, the world eventually tried to take that voice away. Fast forward to the Greco-Roman era, every major power wanted a piece of Egypt's paper empire. Papyrus became so valuable, it was hoarded, copied, smuggled, even faked. And when other civilizations tried to break Egypt's monopoly, Egypt wasn't having it. Take this, there's a story that King Ptolemy V refused to export papyrus to rival libraries like the one in Pergamon. His plan? Starve them of scrolls, keep Egypt as the knowledge superpower. Pergamon responded by inventing parchment. Yup, your modern book pages. Indirect revenge against papyrus protectionism. But Egypt didn't care. As long as the Nile kept flowing and papyrus kept growing, they stayed in control. You want to read? You come to Egypt. You want to write history? Better do it on Egyptian paper. That's not just economic power, that's cultural domination. Eventually, yes, papyrus lost its crown. Parchment and later paper from China took over the world. But even then, the legacy didn't fade. The word paper literally comes from papyrus. Think about that. The name outlived the product. That's how deep it ran. And here's what's funny. Modern Egyptologists still owe their careers to this plant. Every archaeological jackpot, every rediscovered text. They're almost always on fragile, ancient sheets of papyrus. A plant that was born in the mud, but managed to carry gods, kings, and commoners alike into eternity. So while it may not be traded in gold bars today, papyrus bought something far rarer: immortality. Not just for itself, but for the civilization that mastered it. You'd think a plant so crucial to an empire would have had temples built in its name or a cult of worshippers dancing around papyrus stalks. But no. In typical ancient Egyptian fashion, they didn't need flashy shrines for something so quietly powerful. Instead, papyrus got the ultimate nod. It was woven into the very fabric of their mythology, rituals, and iconography. The papyrus plant wasn't just a symbol of writing or knowledge. It was tied to creation itself. In ancient mythology, the marshes of the Nile, dense with papyrus, were believed to be where life began. The god Horus was often depicted rising among the papyrus reeds. The plant wasn't just a background prop, it was the divine stage. Even tombs weren't free from its influence. On the walls of the most sacred burial chambers, you'll find gods holding papyrus scepters, symbolizing life, rebirth, and eternal knowledge. In the afterlife, papyrus fields were seen as paradise, a peaceful realm for the righteous. And in real life, the Egyptians didn't waste a sliver of the stuff. Besides scrolls, they used papyrus to make sandals, baskets, mats, even lightweight boats that skimmed across the Nile like dragonflies. It was the Swiss army knife of the ancient world. Everything, everywhere, all at once. But 3,000 years before multiverses were cool. That's what makes papyrus so wildly impressive. It wasn't just important, it was everywhere, seamlessly blending the sacred and the practical. From scribes and pharaohs to fishermen and priests, everyone touched papyrus in some way. And yet, the plant remained humble, rooted in the mud, thriving quietly, never needing applause. Because when your legacy is written on every wall, buried in every tomb, and whispered in every myth, you don't need monuments. You are the monument. Papyrus wasn't just a plant, it was a quiet architect of empire, soft and green, yet mighty enough to hold up the legacy of kings. Think about that. A reed growing along a muddy riverbank became the medium through which law was passed, poems were preserved, gods were honored, and history itself was born. And even as the centuries rolled by and papyrus faded from daily life, its spirit lived on. Today's word, paper? Yep, direct descendant of papyrus. So next time you jot something down or flip through a book, You're echoing an Egyptian innovation that shaped the world. We often think ancient secrets are locked in treasure chests or buried beneath sand. But sometimes the most powerful tools are hiding in plain sight, growing by the river, waiting to be picked. And if you found that as mind-blowing as we did, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more forgotten wonders of history, and drop a comment. What ancient invention do you think we've totally overlooked today? Thanks for watching, and remember, some of the smartest tools humans ever made were grown, not built.